L stands for Lynn, but I go by Stuart. So it's Lynn Stuart Hirai. Um, I'm pretty much an armchair historian, and what motivated me to do this work is that I'm still going to write a book about my Japanese American mentors who were Nisei, and they were very instrumental in who I am today. And so for me, it's a passion. I've been a member of several of these groups, veteran groups. The most recent is Friends and Family and Nisei Veterans. It's centered in California, and a very active member. And I made a personal promise to a World War II veteran by the name of Lawson Sakai that I would do whatever I could to carry on the legacy of the Japanese American soldiers. And also, I was very personal friends with George Sakato, who was a Medal of Honor recipient who lived in Denver. So I became very good friends with him until he passed away. But just meeting a lot of these veterans, they allowed me into their sacred place and share some things that they hadn't shared with anybody or any interviews. So for me, it was very special to have that kind of privilege. So with that, my first tour actually was in France in the year 2014, and it was really fantastic. And well, I'll just tell a real quick story that when I was walking the streets of Bruyères, France, and this very old fellow, probably a grandfather, was walking his great great grandson, and he stopped me on the street and he pointed to me and he told his grandson that without him, and he's pointing to me, without him, you would be speaking German instead of French. And that really, really hit me. And so I made a promise to myself that, I'd get more involved. And in fact, I've entertained notions of going to Italy because they had the tour of Italy a year before in 2013. And of course, I missed that. But I contacted the tour director who had never really done any tours in Italy. And I said, hey, would you like to organize a small group tour for me to go on a tour of Italy? And I'll pay it out of my own pocket. And then once I announced that, five other people said, we want to go with you. So that started the concept of the small group tours by Nisei Legacy Tours. And Nora is the tour operator for that. And she is super busy. And because of that first small group tours, that was the first of many. But anyhow, that's how I got started. And the other part is my first connection was with the First Special Service Force, reading the unit history uh, by Burhans. And there's a lot of references to the Japanese Americans in that unit history. And I just found that flabbergasting because most of the unit histories that I have seen up to that point in time never really talked about the Japanese Americans like they did. But there was a special relationship between the Japanese Americans and the First Special Service Force. And that's why I became an honorary member because at every opportunity I get when I'm doing these presentations, I will also drop a line about the First Special Service Forces because of that relationship. But anyhow, I wanted to go ahead and get started. The main topic, why did Japanese Americans, the Nisei, fight in World War II? Well, hopefully as we go through this presentation, you'll get this sense. The thing about it is that just trying to set this scene for this anti-Asian sentiment in the United States, it actually started long before World War II. It started with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which really had nothing to do with Japanese Americans, but it halted immigration for 10 years for the Chinese. So that opened the door for immigrants from Japan. And they first went to Hawaii and then eventually the mainland. But as time went on, they also realized, well, I'm not say all, I'm saying that the general population and some of these businessmen and politicians realized that, the complexion of this country, the United States, looks a little bit different. And we really don't want that to happen. So in 1907, a gentleman's agreement between the United States and Japan took place, and it, of course, impacted immigration of Japanese in the U.S. and it supposedly eased tensions, but it had the opposite effect. In fact, Teddy Roosevelt considered the Japanese uh, race as honorary whites, and I thought that was kind of interesting when I first read that because I never been considered an honorary white. I consider myself an American today, but anyhow. That's how things were perceived back in the 1900s, at least with Teddy Roosevelt. But in the meantime, after 1907, there's this effort. The Japanese are, they're starting to do a lot of colonization themselves, of course, with Korea and invading Manchuria and whatnot. They're really causing some havoc in the Pacific. And of course, that gets the attention of the United States Navy and U.S. government. And so in fact, all the military exercise, Navy exercises that they have, their common enemy would be the Japanese. So from the very beginning, at least after World War I, that's when things really started to um, get moving. But before I start talking about World War II specifically, I just want to mention that before World War II even started in May 1941, there were two counterintelligence corps Japanese Americans in Hawaii that volunteered to spy on the Japanese in Manila. So they jumped ship and they started to spy on the Japanese in the open. Of course, they kept their cover. And at about that time in November 1941, Japanese language school at the Presidio started up, which was the Military Intelligence Service Language School. And that was the first at Christie Field in San Francisco. And that was 1 month before Pearl Harbor. We can imagine that once Pearl Harbor hit, then the demand for Japanese linguists was really important. So that 1 year program that was set for the first class at Christie Field turned into 6 months, and they were first deployed to the Pacific in May 1942. So, of course, with the military, the Navy, they didn't trust these Nisei because we were considered an enemy race, and it didn't make any difference if you were a Japanese national or a Japanese American. You were still considered an enemy race because it was your race that bombed Pearl Harbor. So, and then with the anti-Asian, anti-Japanese sentiment that took place of the Chinese, all that hate was just directed right to the Japanese. And of course, no one ever thought that the Japanese would ever attack Pearl Harbor, and that includes most of the Navy. Of course, there were some people in the Navy and Army that thought that that could happen. It would happen. George Marshall didn't think it would happen, but anyhow, it did. And in 1940, there was a National Guard unit. It was a 298th and 299th Infantry Regiments in Hawaii National Guard. They were federalized in fall of 1940, and they opened up a draft. And of course, when they were federalized and all this training took place, and then after Pearl Harbor, it was one of these things where, well, we've got Japanese Americans, we got Chinese, we've got Filipinos, we've got Hawaiians, Caucasians, all different mixes of races and ethnicity in this unit. It was really a melting pot, and they all got together for the most part. And then when Pearl Harbor hit, things changed. You had these National Guard Japanese Americans who knew how to fire a rifle, and after the first transport ships arrived, Hawaii, the military ended up taking their arms away, and they didn't really know what to do with these guys. But eventually, they shipped the 1,432 Japanese Americans, and there are some Hawaiians in there too, to the mainland of United States in Oakland, California. They left on June 5, and about a week later they arrived. But in the meantime, the Battle of Midway took place. And after the Battle of Midway, then that was when four of the Japanese Imperial Navy aircraft carriers were sunk. And the threat of a Japanese invasion was greatly lessened. But That's kind of pretty much what happened. And then, of course, with the first class of the MIS being sent to the Pacific, a lot of the commanders in the Pacific didn't know what to do with these guys, but it took a while. And unfortunately, it may have taken too long, maybe 2, 3 months. But the Japanese American MIS, they were frustrated because they wanted to help the war effort and they knew that they could. But like I said, it took a couple of the Caucasian officers to convince the higher ups that they could do what they could. And the one of the commanders of the Maricao Division at Guadalcanal was Alexander Patch, and his name pops up uh, uh, in the future in Europe. But I'll keep moving on here. Of course, with Pearl Harbor, every all the hate that was directed toward the Chinese went right to the Japanese, and like I said, we were considered an enemy race, and things were really tough. So I wanted to get some of this definition terms straight. Issei, they're considered the first generation Japanese. They were born in Japan. Nisei, they're second generation Japanese, born to Issei parents. But the Nisei were American citizens. Kibei, they were also born in America. They're considered Nisei, but they went to Japan to study. So that's where the Kibei comes from. In fact, in the Pacific, if it wasn't for the Kibei, it would have been very difficult for the Nisei to really help the war effort. The Kibei were really instrumental in bringing Japan to their knees and saving countless lives and shortening the war by at least 2 years. So the Kibei were really helpful. And Sansei, I'm a Sansei. I'm the product of Nisei, and from my parents, they were born in America. And by the way, my dad was military intelligence service during the occupation of Japan. My mother, she was Nisei. She was a Kibei that was sent to Japan, but she got stuck during the war. So she was one of the 15 to 20,000 Nisei who were trapped in Japan all during the war. Now you got the fourth generation, the Yonsei. They would be my kids. And heaven forbid, if my kids had kids, then they would be considered fifth generation or Gosei. But the primary generation we'll be talking about here will be the Nisei as it relates to the 142nd Regimental Combat Team. And when you're talking about this misleading terminology, I mean, the World War II was fraught with these euphemisms. This came out as Supreme Court Justice Owen Roberts in his dissenting opinion in Korematsu versus U.S. December 18, 1944. An assembly center was a euphemism for a prison. So-called relocation centers, a euphemism for concentration camps. And of course, concentration camps has a different kind of a meaning depending on where you're at because concentration camps was the moniker that FDR used in 1936 when he wrote a memo to the Navy Department about what to do with these Japanese. Of course, he didn't differentiate between Japanese nationals, Japanese Americans. As far as he was concerned, they were all the same. But he brought up the term concentration camps, and it was a contention of Frank Knox and uh, primarily Secretary of the Navy and FDR that if war broke out, uh, people of Japanese descent would be put in concentration camps in Hawaii and kept there. But heaven forbid that happening. But like I said, the Hawaiians, primarily Japanese Americans, they had inroads with local government, local politics, and they interface with the citizens, local and county, state governments, including federal, which was the FBI. And so, there was really no threat, so to speak, because these officials knew that the people of Japanese descent in Hawaii were vastly loyal. So that's why even though they had martial law right after Pearl Harbor, uh, Delas Emmons, when he took over General Short's job, he was briefed on the relationship, and he only sent like 2,000. of the 136,000 Japanese Hawaiians who were in Hawaii at that time to the mainland. And so for him, it was just a minute effort just to appease Secretary Knox and FDR. But FDR and Knox wanted the whole population. Well, the population of Hawaii, there were about over one third of the population there were laborers. So if you take away one third of the workforce, what's going to happen? So that's why hard, large scale evacuation of people of Japanese descent in Hawaii did not take place. And I'm just going to put these terms up here for just kind of put them up there. I'm sure it'll be recorded so people can take a look at it and get an idea of all these euphemisms. What's really interesting is that the government did everything they could to hide the real intent, and it's fraught with these euphemisms. And for example, I didn't know that I would be considered a non-alien. You know, I mean, I'm a citizen, but those were the kind of words that the government used to kind of hide the real intent because they didn't want a massive outcry of incarcerating American citizens in camps or concentration camps, let alone. So, but aliens, of course, they're non-citizens, but you know, a Japanese national by nature is a non-citizen. So, you know, why call them alien and the non-aliens for citizens? It's just, like I said, it was just fraught with disguising the real intent of what the government wanted to do. Now, Executive Order 9066 was signed by Franklin Roosevelt on February 19th, 1942, which was a day of remembrance. Beginning in March 1942 and ending in August 42, there would be a total of 108 civilian exclusion orders issued by the Wartime Civil Control Administration of the Western Defense Command. And that was commanded by General DeWitt. And he was initially, he was against the incarceration of any persons of Japanese descent, but he caved in to political pressure and he became really venomous toward the uh, people of Japanese descent. In fact, he always said that the Jap's a Jap. So that's the common wording that was used throughout the time that his tenure when he was the uh, head of the Wartime Civil Control Administration at the Western Defense Command. In fact, the Presidio, or the first class of the MIS, they were in that Western Defense Command. And because of Executive Order 9066, they had to move the Military Intelligence Service Language School to Camp Savage to get them out of the exclusion zone. And then with the demand for MIS LS, they moved it to Fort Snelling because it was a larger facility. Now, this is just a sample. This is the number 5 of 108. The bottom line for this is that they didn't give you too much time to pack up your belongings, and essentially what it was what you could carry. You couldn't take any pets. You couldn't take any items that were larger than a suitcase. So the government said, you know, we'll put them in storage at your own risk. But as it turned out, most of these storage facilities were looted. So most of the Japanese Americans who had taken advantage of the storage after the camps were complete at the end of the war, there was very little to recover. Now one wonders, well, how did the government know which areas to have and to put? Let's see, let me get my laser here. I thought I had that thing ready to go. But can you see my pointer? But there's this line here between Washington, Oregon, California, parts of Arizona. This was the exclusion zone. So if you were west of that line, then you went to a camp. If you were to the east of this line, then you were not. So that's how the government established these zones. And the assembly centers, uh, Puyallup, Washington, Portland, Oregon. My family, they were assembled in Portland, Oregon. And there's had ones in Marysville, Sacramento. The relocation centers, or the so-called concentration camps, there's 10 of these. Manzanar, Tule Lake were in California. Poston and Gila River, they were in Arizona. Minidoka was in Idaho. Heart Mountain was in Wyoming. Grenada, which was in Colorado. You had Topaz in Utah. And Rohr and Jerome were in Arkansas. So when you see these, this is where the 10 concentration camps were located. Gila, Poston, Topaz, Grenada, Heart Mountain. My aunt was in Minidoka. I had an uncle that was in Heart Mountain. My grandfather was in Bismarck. He was in Nisei, so they had to put him somewhere because he was a real troublemaker, so to speak, but he really wasn't. Then he was like 57 years old. So what's a 57-year-old going to do? And then you had in California, you had Manzanar and Tule Lake, which is just a little south of the Oregon border. And want to also mention the citizen isolation camps in Moab, Utah, and Loop, Arizona. This is where they put the so-called troublemakers, anyone who uh, really took the Constitution of the United States to the nth degree, then they were considered troublemakers when they try to get others to join their cause. Uh-oh, what's going on here? Okay. And this is another idealized viewing showing the pink shaded area is the areas that would be excluded, and the star areas are the 10 concentration camps. So it gives you an idea of what they look like. And this is just another map here, pretty much the same. You had uh, the assembly centers. I want to identify the star areas like Lordsburg or Fort Bliss or Fort Richardson. You got Kilauea, Haku, Sand Island, Honolulu, Kalaheo. These were considered U.S. Army installations where they housed Japanese. Camp McCoy was one. So these were the star ones are the ones that were administered by the U.S. Army. And this was your typical, on to what it was like to be in an assembly center. You had a little name tag and with your family name and a number. And this is what they used to identify which camp, which assembly center you would go to. Of course, when you had these exclusion orders, it would tell you where to assemble, and then from there, you went to an assembly center until the main camp was constructed. And these are some of the incarcerated kids. I mean, if you were 12 years old and over, you were fingerprinted. And this is the kind of aerial view of what Grenada or Mache camp looked like. They're pretty basic, no insulation, tar paper, uh, sides. I mean, when the wind blew, sand and dirt would fly in. It was cold in the winter, hot in the summer. Very little privacy because there were no partitions. You had a common ceiling, so there was no partitions that went up to the ceiling. Noises could be heard from throughout the entire barrack. And of course, these camps were located in the most isolated and desolate locations in the American West. And to that Yeah, it's pretty much the same as it is today, actually. I've been out to most of the camps, and they're pretty much without the barracks there. That's exactly what you see. Of course, what you see now, and there's nothing out there, and there's no development. And what's interesting is that the incarcerees did what they could to maintain some sense of normalcy. And with the kids, I think kids who were younger than 12, they considered the camp experience fun, um, because for the most part, their parents isolated and them or uh, kept them from experiencing any negativity. So for the most part, they were insulated from any of the other activities that would be going on at these camps because there were some resistance, and their parents did all they could to make sure that the little ones were kept away from that. And of course, if you're older, they had Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts. They tried to have all the activities that you would have if you were at home. And in fact, at Hard Mountain, they had so many Boy and Girl Scouts troops that it actually had its own council. That's how large it was. So Scouts was very popular in as far as um, being a main uh, organization to keep kids occupied. And of course, like I said, children fared the best. And of course, they didn't have their so-called Japanese fare that they would have at home. They had a hard time adjusting to mutton. In fact, they didn't even care for it. So when mutton was served, then the cafeteria was, or the dining hall was pretty much empty. But eating things that they've never eaten before was pretty much the norm in all the camps. And the camps grew their own food. In fact, a couple of the camps, I think three or four of these camps were on reclamation land, and they actually had contracts with the U.S. government to extend irrigation canals. So with that happening, they were able to irrigate and plant crops that previous farmers could never grow that kind of crop in that area. In fact, some of the camps actually provided foodstuffs for the other camps. So that's how productive that they were. And residents, they try to do the best they can to make it like home. But like I said, there's no privacy. Um, they try to make sure that the families were together. And of course, if you were single, then you had a smaller room and in a common barrack with others. And of course, if you worked, um, it's really interesting because if you were unskilled labor, then you got $12 a month. So if you worked 500 hours a month, you only got $12. It didn't make any difference. They only went by the month. If you were skilled, like for example, if you were a medical doctor or a dentist or a nurse, you got up to $16 a month. But again, if you worked 500 hours, you didn't get overpay. You got $16. And that was the disparity of what was going on. But if you chose to work, at least you got some money. And it's just the typical mess hall. What's really interesting about the mess hall is that this is where the Issei lost their influence with the typical family, because in typical Japanese families and American families, they all ate together at the same time. But at the camp, you had dining halls. So teenagers had a tendency to eat with their friends, and over time, it eroded the family dynamics, the family system. And of course, this is the other part here where no privacy. I think in time they had some partitions, but there were no doors. Uh, Especially the women, they had a really hard time adjusting because some of these women will put sacks over the head so people could not identify them. It was really pretty bad. And this is the typical camp configuration. Poston Manzanar had a similar arrangement. Gila River, Tule Lake, they all had separate ones. Of course, Tule Lake, because it was a segregation center in the last couple years, they had to construct a different layout for that camp. And then Grenada, Hard Mountain, Jerome, and Rohr Topaz, they had pretty much the same kind of arrangement for the camp. And Minidoka, very similar to the others. But I think the big thing was that they had a recreation building. And what's really interesting about these camps is that they were all different. They had different dynamics. They had their own different personalities. You had the barbed wire, and that's the other thing too, is that when they had the barbed wire fence went up, they hated that because that's when they realized that yeah, they're being incarcerated. And of course, with the machine gun towers, uh, and they were pointed inside, it kind of blew the myth that we're putting you in there to protect you. Well, why are the machine guns pointed inside if you're trying to protect us? So yeah, that kind of went by the wayside really quick. And this is the 10 camps. I put this up here just to give you an idea. Manzanar was the first one that was constructed. In fact, my grandfather and uncle helped construct Manzanar. Uh, Jerome was the last, which is in October. But what's really interesting is that in March at Manzanar in the Owens Valley there, it's cold in March. So those are pretty cold conditions. Of course, by the time the other camps were made up for occupancy, you're talking Poston, Tule Lake, Healy River, Minidoka, Hart Mountain, Amache, Topaz. Gosh, it was hot during that time period. So you've got Manzanar when it first opened, freezing to death, but in time in summer it got pretty hot too. But most of these camps, when it was ready for occupancy, it was hot and it was dusty. So you just can imagine these incarcerated people going in these camps under these conditions. It was definitely intolerable. And this is just a pie chart of the peak population of the camps based on the information I had from the previous slide. Uh, a total of about 113,000 Japanese Americans were incarcerated. Uh, there's another project that's going on to identify all Japanese Americans who were impacted, and that amounts to a little over 125,000 and growing because there's some percentage of Japanese Americans who were never part of the camp experience. In fact, my family, when they were at Portland Assembly Center, they heard how bad the camps were going to be. So under the Oregon plan by Governor Sprague, he had a plan to put the Japanese Americans to work as laborers. And the big difference between the camp pay and securing an outside contract with, say, the sugar company, which is what my uncle and 350 other families did, they were able to secure labor contracts with the sugar factory and they got prevailing rates. So, but they were never in a camp. They were in a camp without a fence. All they had was a curfew. So anything was better than a camp, according to my dad, and I'd have to agree with him. So my family, and this is before I was born, they spent their time at a CCC camp, Civilian Conservation Corps camp, and until a sponsor built two homes for my family to live in because they needed a sponsor. And when the work was done, then this particular sponsor owned two car dealerships in Nisei and Ontario, Oregon, and he put my uncle, two uncles, and my dad to work on his ranch, and that's how they were able to get away from the camp experience. And this is a picture of the labor camps. If you look at Oregon, this is where I grew up in, and that's where the first labor camp was established under the Oregon Plan. And my family never went back to Washington State. They stayed in Oregon. And this is just the arrangement of the monuments that are at the camps now. And to memorialize what's there. And some camps have more assets than others. Minidoka, Hart Mountain, Manzanar. These camps have quite a few assets. So if you have an opportunity to go visit, or better yet, attend a pilgrimage, I encourage you to try to do that. So when the military first started put out the call for volunteers. They thought that they could get at least 3,000 from the camps. Well, they were pretty shamed when they only got about 1,208. And this is the breakdown of the initial volunteers that came out of the camp. And of course, in Hawaii, they had 10,000 show up. So they had to revise the figures. So they upped the numbers of the potential volunteers from Hawaii up to 2,500, and the volunteers from the camps to 1,500. And over time, there's a couple databases that I'm looking at here. One database has a little over 9,000 that came from the camps, and information from Echoes of Silence from these camps shows about little almost 7,400. So there's some disparity, but I think a lot of it is some of these incarcerees may have stretched their leanings toward which camp. So anyhow, it is what it is. But obviously, there were quite between 7,000 and 9,000 Japanese Americans who eventually entered the military. And when they did, they were part of the 142nd, which is already in combat at this time in Italy. You had the Merrill's Marauders. There was 14 Japanese Americans who were assigned to Merrill's Marauders. You had women in the Women Army Corps and in the MISLS. Um, you had the Central Bureau in Australia had MISLS, and then the little figure over onto the right here, that's the after the bombing of the Abbey Monte Casino. The Japanese Americans, when they were attached to the 34th Infantry Division, the Abbey was still intact. In fact, they were involved in the first battle, and they almost took it, but they just didn't have enough reinforcements to uh, carry the hill. And then the picture below there is in Briere, France, and at the bottom there is aboard the USS Missouri during the surrender, Japan. And then you in July, August of 1946, that's when Truman recognizes the 142nd. So these were the commands of uh, the where the Japanese Americans were at, and of course with the MIS, they were part of the Alaska Defense Command, South Pacific Command, Southwest Pacific Command, Central Pacific Command, Southeast Asia, and then with the 142nd, they were part of the European. And then you had the Continental U.S. Command, and you had the Canadian Command. What's interesting about the Canadians is that they did not have Japanese Canadians. Especially in British Columbia. They had incarcerated their Japanese Canadians, and they kept them out of the war until Churchill put the pressure on them, and then finally they had their Japanese Canadians trained. But by that time, it's toward the end of the war. But they had to get interpreters and whatnot, so they borrowed them from the United States. So MISLS, Nisei were attached to every combat unit and all of the allies in the Pacific. So this is the 100th. For example, they were there in August 1943 through September 44. The first time with the 442nd, they showed up in June of 44, and then they were attached to the 100th, and then they both left for France. And at the end of September, and then they stayed in France until March 1945. So in April 45 to July, they're together and they're back in Italy. And this medal here, that's 80th anniversary that I had made up for our visits to dignitaries in Italy and made up a medal and some challenge coins. So I freely passed those out during our visits. But I identified the Po Valley, the Gothic Line, Hill 140, Anzio, the Abbey Monte Cassino, Rapido River, Monte Majo, the Volturno River, San Angelo de Leaf, and Monte Murano. Those are the main battles that the 100 fought when they first there. And they were attached to the 34th Division. uh, 59 of the 34th soldiers were KIA, and there were 21 Japanese Americans uh, who also died during that campaign. And before this time period, that's when Charles Ryder, the commander of the 34th, was so impressed with the Japanese Americans that he authorized them to wear the 34th Infantry Division's shoulder patch. And that was a big honor for them. And this is the on parade in Italy. You have Mark Clark there, and look how short the Japanese Americans were. They're about average height was about 5'4". They weighed about 110 pounds wet. And this is a visit King George, and on the left, and then with the Patterson on the right. And the soldier to Patterson's right is the only Korean officer, Young Ok Kim, and he is really vocal. In fact, he's more vocal than the Nisei, which was a good thing actually, because he was outspoken. And this is the one of the plaques that you'll see. I took this picture, I think in Italy. I can't exactly remember where. But here, with the First Special Service Force, after they had their first day, their combat on Mount La Defense, Remitanie, and Samukro, the 100 was attached to the force because by this time, the First Special Service Force, they initially started with 1,800 combat riflemen. By the time they hit Maho, they were down to 400. So where were they going to get replacements, or at least people who could be attached? And that's what they called on the 100th. And they were part of Task Force B. And they followed up the 3rd Regiment that went up to Mount Maho. And then after they took the Mount Maho and Vicitaro, and Task Force B was dissolved, Robert Frederick said, "Well, I want to continue holding on to the 100th," and he assigned them to go ahead and take San Michel, which is what they did. And this is the deployment of the 100th and the First Special Service Force at Mount Maho and Vicitaro. What's really interesting about Maho is that I think I got another picture. Yeah, I got this picture here. This is taken at Mount Maho, and you've got the 3rd Regiment commander, which is Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Walker, and had the force man bringing down German prisoners. And German prisoners see these Japanese Americans all around them, and the German POW asks the force man, who are these? Who are these men? Are these Japanese? And that's when the force man said, "Well, haven't you heard? They're on our side now." So that was part of the psychological warfare that the first Special Service Force loved to do because they just loved to tear up the Germans in any way they could. And just focus here on the one on the left is just another rendition. I'll have another showing of the graphics on the right. But this is after they took care of the Germans at Mount Montefiore in January of 44. Their next objective was the Abbey Minor Casino. But in order to get there, they had to cross this flooded area that the Germans flooded, and it was a kill zone. And even with smoke shells from artillery, when the wind shifted, then they were exposed. And the Japanese Americans the 100, they got plastered, and but they were still able to get across this kill zone, and almost with the entire division of the 34th, almost took the Abbey. And this battle took place 24th of January to mid February 1944. They almost took it, almost, but they couldn't. And then that's when uh, the New Zealand commander Freyberg decided to, convince the higher ups to bomb the Abbey, and that made things worse because it was not sometime in mid-May before they were able to secure the Abbey Monte Casino at horrendous losses to primarily the Polish troops. And after the war, when the Abbey was reconstructed, the Japanese Americans of the 100th were able to donate a stained glass window at the chapel of the Saint Scholastica. And if you have an opportunity to go there, that would be a special tour. You can see the insignia of the 100th Battalion there. It's the taro leaf and the war helmet of the Hawaiians. And when I was there a few years ago, I asked the tour guide what she thought that was, and she said, "Oh, she thought it was a religious symbol." And I go, "Well, that ought to make the Japanese Americans, the Buddha heads, uh, laugh at that." And I explained to her, "No, that's the insignia for the Japanese Americans of the 100th who were involved in the first battle." And I'm going to really pick up the pace here, but this is the uh, configuration, what happened with the Canadian unit there, USA Canadian, the First Special Service Force. By this time, because they had lost so many of the original members, there were no replacements. Their replacements came from remnants of Darby's Rangers and paratrooper units. And in fact, Robert Frederick recommended that Mark Clark disband the First Special Service Force or make it into a regiment because the kind of combat that the force was being used was not the kind of unconventional combat that the force was initially trained to do. But they were in the process of being trained and being refurbished as a regiment. And during that process, on May 23rd, they tried to make a breakout. And unfortunately, they had left a gap on their left flank, and which is supposed to be filled by the 3rd Infantry Division. And the Germans seized that opportunity to force their panzers, reinforce infantry, and they breached the gap. And a call from the G2 from Force to Truscott said, things have blown up here. So Truscott, knowing that that would probably happen, he called in the 133rd Regiment, which had the 100th attached, and the 100th screened the attack of the force as they proceeded further north. And when the force men saw the Japanese Americans, they referred to the Japanese Americans as old friends. And that was from Mount Maho, Mount Vishitaro. At Mount Maho, Mount Vishitaro, Japanese Americans lost 13 of their own on that mountain. So this is in the meantime, a little after the fall of Rome, the 442nd shows up, and I want to show that far as your organic unit, you have a first, second, third battalion. With the 142nd, the 100th kept their designation because of the battle honors. And so you have the 100th and then the second and third battalions. And this is the organic composition, and you can cut and paste. You could attach or detach an anti-tank company, which is what they did for Operation Dragoon. And then in March of 1945, they detached the 522nd Field Artillery, and they stayed with the 7th Army in France. And of course, you got to have a band. And this was the first day of combat for the 442nd, 2nd, and 3rd Battalion. The best way to describe the 100 was that they would be considered the older brothers and uncles of the younger 442nd. 442nd was formed up in February 1943, and they were young whippersnappers. In fact, they didn't take much advice from the 100th, and so they thought they could take the objective, but there was a communication snafu, and what happened was that the 2nd Battalion ended up going too far in advance, and that's where they got exposed to the Germans. 3rd Battalion, they were in a similar situation, but they were being shelled as well. So when the 100th saw what was going on to their younger brothers, that's when they decided, well, get out the battle maps. And, well, without the benefit of a recon of the terrain, they put together a plan. Well, what they didn't know was that Ryder's 34th Recon Group got captured earlier that morning. So there was no intel to show that there were enemy forces in the vicinity of Belvedere. And so when the second, third battalion went forward, they were kind of operating blind. And with that communication fiasco, that made it even worse. So the 100th, they got engaged and they went in there and they just battered this SS battalion. And that's where the 100 got their first unit citation for annihilating an SS battalion. And this is the just some combat along the Hill 140. That's called the Little Casino. In that 5 mile area, five distinct service crosses were earned. And this is the players: Truscott, Virgil Miller's the commander of the 142nd, Mark Clark, and then Ned Allman, commander of the 92nd, and William Yarborough. He, after completed the First Airborne Task Force duties as Robert Frederick's airborne commander, he took over the 473rd Infantry Regiment, and he fought alongside the Japanese Americans in the Gata Line battle of April 1945. He loved the Japanese Americans. And this is the Fogarito Hill Ridge line. All the attacks took place from the left to the right. They always did frontal attacks. The 92nd just could not take the hill. So what was left was you got options: frontal pincher movement, daylight or night, or conventional surprise. Well, the 92nd did frontal, daylight, conventional, and they failed. So the only other option was a pincher, night, or surprise, and that's why it was decided a pincher's attack at dawn with a surprise element and all-night climb to get in position for the dawn assault to take place April 5, 1945. So the least likely, most difficult avenue approach was deliberately chosen. And this is what you got. You got Mount Fogarito, which is the objective on that whole ridge line, and then Lozano. That was actually taken by a regiment of the 371st of the 92nd Infantry Division. So they actually did some good by capturing that salient. And that's where this next, this is looking to the southwest, looking Fogarito, you got Savetta, Ohio 123, Georgia, and Florida. And they got the Ozano here in the foreground. But Florida and Georgia, that was the 100's objective, and they would be coming up from the south. The 442nd 3rd Battalion would be coming from the north and hit Fogarito and then meet up with the 100th at Mount Soretta. So here's what's going on. They had to do this at nighttime, undercover, and once they got in place, they early or late, I should say, on the 4th of April, then they went down the valley and then up, and then they reached the hilltop around 6 o'clock. They were about an hour behind schedule because the 100th, they actually started their battle a little after 5 o'clock in the morning on April 5. So this is what it looked like from the south. And this is what the 3rd Battalion had to do the night before, late, and get up to the Fogarito Ridge line without being detected. And they were ordered that if you fall off this ridge, you are not to yell. So, okay. So they secured their dog tags so they wouldn't make any noise. And then they were able to pursue, and they got up the ridge line. Total surprise to the Germans. Germans had no idea that the Japanese Americans or any force would come from that direction. It was a total surprise. And in order to take Mount Fogarito, L Company had to take this route. And when you're looking at the Mount Fogarito from the little valley here, little meadow, they're actually on the other side of this ridge because there's a machine gun nest here. So if you're on this side, they could pick you off, but they're actually on the other side, away from that machine gun nest. Yes. Okay, I got to get going. So anyhow, here we go. The 100, they make their advance from the south. They reach Georgia Hill in 32 minutes. For 5 months, the 92nd could not take the hill, but in 32 minutes, elements of the 100 crested Georgia Hill. And 2 days later, they met up with the L Company of the 442nd at Mount Soretta. But there's still a lot of mopping up to do. And this is just another map that was there at that parking lot just below um, near a restaurant. Uh, Pasquille, yeah, this is the restaurant here, Pasquille. And these are reenactors at Mount Carchill, Mount Belvedere, and some of the foxholes that the Germans had, and it was occupied by the Americans. This is a Toscana 44 group. It's a young reenactor group that has taken on Hill 140 to resurrect it. And Davide Juarez, he's one of our main historians that we've been going to for quite a few years. And this was the plaque that the Toscana 44 put up there on Hill 140, also known as the Little Casino. But the whole Fogarito Ridge couldn't be done without aerial support. And with the P-47s, the Rover Joe and the Rover Pete, it paid dividends. They did a wonderful job in knocking the heck out of the Germans and the Bersaglieri units of the Italian fascists on that ridgeline. And this is just a little plaque that the David put up, and this is the Gothic Line Association members. This is the plaque close up. And this is a statue of Sadao Munamori. He was actually put in for a Medal of Honor shortly after he saved two of his comrades, but that was downgraded to a Distinguished Service Cross. But it took the intervention of Utah Senator and Mike Masaoka, who was the PR person with the service company of 442nd, to put pressure on the Army to provide, to honor, and to award Munamori a Medal of Honor within World War II. The other 20 Medals of Honor would take a lot longer to get. Am I running out of time?
No, keep going. People will stay
Okay.
as they will. So, another 10 or 15 minutes, I suppose.
Okay, I think I can whip that up pretty quick. I'm pretty close now. And this is a Tendola. This is pretty close to where the late Senator Dan Inouye was wounded and where he got his DSC. And they have a little park up there just behind me from the picture on the left that commemorates the Medal of Honor recipients. And even though these are the 21, only 16 were earned in Italy. The other five, as I will discuss a little later, were earned in France. But Tendola is one of these wonderful areas, towns that have adopted the 142nd, and that particular church tower is where one of the Japanese Americans was sniped by a sniper at that tower, and he's commemorated here at this park. And this is at the Wonderland Museum. Got Luciano Bucci with one of our operators or tour group participants getting a commemorative 80th anniversary medal. And really good friends with Luciano. He's also he's an honorary member of the First Special Service Force as well. These are battle campaigns. The Anti-Tank Company of the 442nd, they were detached in July in 1944, and they were part of the glider group that glided into Lemuy, France. And then in the Central Europe campaign, March 22nd, the 522nd Field Artillery was detached from the 142nd, and they were attached to the 7th Army under Alexander Patch. And so what was really interesting about the 522nd is that they had a really high percentage of creating casualties amongst the Germans and other combatants. The average was, I think, 47% in Pacific, 60 to 65% in Europe with the American units, Allied units. But with the 522nd, they were as high as 70, 75%. And they were accurate, they were fast, they were quick, and that's why they were highly sought after as an artillery unit. And there were no friendly fire incidents. So that's another plus. And this is a overall campaign map of where the Japanese Americans were at. Um, they actually 522nd, they actually crossed into the Rhine with the 45th Infantry Division under the command of Major General Robert Frederick. That name pops up a lot. But it's the 522nd that fires the first salvos of artillery into Germany, and they're attached to the 45th. And as soon as they cross the Rhine, they become the lead spear of the artillery, and they pursue the Germans all the way to Berchtesgaden. And they're actually attached to the 101st Airborne. And uh, this is like May 2nd, May 3rd, 4th. That's 45. That's where they spend the end of the war. But that's where they also discover earlier on the number of uh, subcamps of Dachau, and they liberate a few of those on their way to the east. So this is pretty much where they were, 142nd. The 100th, they're engaged in combat by themselves until about June 4th, 1944. And then the 442nd, they join up with the 100 around June 26th. That's the first day of combat. And then April 5, that's when the Gothic Line battle starts, the so-called diversionary attack that really works out magnificently for the Fifth Army and Lucian Truscott and the 473rd Infantry Regiment under Yarborough. They line up with the 142nd and they kick butt all along uh, up to the border of France. Uh, Talk quickly about the Medal of Honor. In the year 2000, 57, 56, 55 years after the fact, uh, 20 additional medals of honor are awarded after a study is done to uh, determine if medals of honor should have been awarded instead of a Distinguished Service Cross. And it turns out that, yeah, and uh, 16 of the 21 medals of honor uh, were awarded for action in Italy by the 142nd. And what's really interesting is that the first, let's see, three, four, the first five of these were members of the 100th, and this is like 1943. So that's where the 57 years comes in, where their DSCs were upgraded. Kiyoshi Muranaga, he was with the F Company of the 442nd. Let's see, one, two, yeah. So we got up to Nakai, Bani Hajiro, Kuroda, Okubo, Sakato, and Nishimoto. They're the five that got their DSCs upgraded to Medal of Honor in France. Munamori, he was the first. And so the others would follow, 57, 56, 55 years after the fact. And of course, the late Senator Inoue was the last to get his. And these are the Medal of Honor recipients who came from the camps. And they had a real good showing. And this is some of the stats of the KIAs, wounded, and MIAs. The 142nd, when you look at the other units, especially the 473rd, it's a lot lower. But still, I mean, anyone who was KI or wounded or MIA, it's still pretty serious. But look at the numbers, uh, it's still a lot lower than what the 473rd had. And this is the total casualties in the KIAs in Italy was about 451, 275 for the 100th and 176 for the 442nd. And out of the camps, 230 were killed. And I've got these numbers broken down by camps and the wards that they amassed. But the thing is that why did they fight? They fought for me. What they did was they fought for the sake of the children. When they went into the camps, they went into camps because to show their loyalty, because that's what they were told. They were told by authorities, well, if you go into the camps, that's one way of showing your loyalty or working. The Kodomo no Tami ni, that's for the sake of the children. That's a phrase that's used to this day by Go for Broke National Education Center and other groups. Okagasama Day, I am what I am because of you. That's me. That's why I want to write a book about my Japanese American mentors because I am what I am because of you. They paved the way for me to have the resources to do what I want to do, and in order to perpetuate the legacy of not only Japanese American soldiers, but all soldiers who participated in World War II. And then Nidoto Nai no Nini, that is, let it not happen again. And that's something that needs to be stressed into the future. And that's why you see a lot of activists with the Japanese American community to this day involved in what's going on with uh, immigration and whatnot. And in the year 2010, the Congress authorized the Congressional Gold Medal for the Nisei soldiers. And the you got the 100 Battalion at the lower left. You got on the right there the Statue of Liberty torch. That's the 442nd, and the MIS Sphinx. That's the um, insignia for the MIS. And in 2021, the post office authorized a soldier stamp, and that's Whitey Yamamoto. He's was part of the anti-tank company in France that glided into southern France at Lemuy. And I think that's pretty much it. And so anyhow, that's the conclusion of my presentation.